All right, in this analysis, we are going to do a forensic deep dive into a tafsir, or exegesis, of Surah Maryam, verse 50. We're not just going to skim the surface here. The whole point is to unpack the author's complete argument about theological reasoning, step by step. We're going to look at every key term, every single example, and all the evidence the author puts on the table. So let's get right into it.
So here's our roadmap for breaking down the author's argument. First, we'll tackle what the text points to as the core problem, which is something called analogical reasoning, or qiyas. Then we'll get into the really important distinctions the author makes inside that concept. After that, we're going to explore two big case studies, the flawed logic of Pharaoh on one hand and the Qur'an's focus on creation on the other. And finally, we'll see how it all comes together in a conclusion about the proper role of our own intellect.
Okay, so let's jump into the central issue that the author raises. This isn't just a minor point, it's a fundamental problem in methodology that, according to this text, has been the source of some major theological errors.
Now, the one term you absolutely have to get your head around is qiyas. In Islamic law, it's a well-known tool. It's basically reasoning by analogy. You take a ruling for a situation you already know about from the texts, find the underlying reason for it, and then apply that same ruling to a brand new situation that shares that same reason. This concept is right at the heart of everything we're about to discuss.
And here, we can actually see the source text itself. The author's whole argument hinges on this. While qiyas might be fine for legal stuff, using it for the core principles of faith, the very nature of God, the concept of tawhid, is a huge mistake. The text actually calls this out as a primary source of going astray.
And listen, the stakes here are incredibly high. This isn't just some academic squabble. The author is making a very serious claim that using our human, limited analogies to try and figure out the divine essence or these fundamental beliefs, well, that's a path that can actually lead to kufr, or disbelief. So the critique isn't about the tool itself, but about using it in a domain where it's fundamentally dangerous.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The author doesn't just say all analogies are bad. No, instead, the text draws this really critical line in the sand between two totally different kinds of reasoning. And getting this distinction is key to the entire argument.
And here it is. On one hand, you've got qiyas istinbati. Think of this as a deductive or extractive analogy. This is the one the author has a problem with. It's where you start with a human idea or observation and try to deduce something about God. On the other hand, you have qiyas istishhadi. This is more of an evidential or testimonial analogy, and the text presents this as the method the Qur'an uses. It starts with a divine sign, something in creation or in the text, and uses it as evidence to point to a greater truth. So one is human-centric, the other is divine-centric. It's a huge difference.
Now, to make this less abstract, the author gives us a really powerful case study. We're going to dig into the logic of Pharaoh, who is presented as the ultimate example of this flawed qiyas istinbati in action.
So when Pharaoh makes his famous declaration, "I am your Lord, the Most High," the text argues this isn't just a burst of arrogance. It's actually the logical endpoint of a very specific and very wrong kind of analogical thinking.
Let's actually unpack his logic. The source text explains it like this. Pharaoh looked around and saw his own tangible power, right? He controlled the Nile, which was the literal source of life and wealth for everyone. From that visible, earthly premise of control, he made a huge analogical jump. He basically reasoned, I control this source of life, therefore I must be the ultimate source of life. He analogized his limited worldly power to absolute divinity.
Now, looking at the source text again, we see the author breaking down the Qur'an's response. And what's fascinating is that the Qur'an doesn't even bother to argue with Pharaoh on his own terms. Instead, it just completely shatters his premise by introducing evidence on a completely different cosmic scale.
So the Qur'an's refutation is essentially this. Oh, you control a river? That's cute. But what about the one who created the heavens and the earth? It's an argument from scale. The act of creating the entire universe is presented as infinitely greater proof of power. This is qiyas istishhadi in action. It uses a massive sign, creation itself, as evidence to just obliterate Pharaoh's small, flawed analogy.
Okay, so now that we've seen the flawed method deconstructed, the author shifts focus to the valid one, the method that the Qur'an uses again and again, using the raw power and complexity of creation itself as the primary evidence.
The text really highlights this consistent pattern in the Qur'an. When faced with bad human reasoning, the response isn't just, nope, you're wrong. It's a redirection. It's about turning our gaze away from our own little ideas and towards the ayat, the signs all around us in the universe. The sky, the earth, the rain, life, death.
These are presented as the real data points for understanding divine power.
And Pharaoh's logic isn't some one-off thing. The author points out that this pattern of flawed human reasoning shows up all the time. It's the same logic behind blindly following traditions just because your ancestors did it. It's the same logic the polytheist in Mecca used. And it's the root of attributing divine qualities to anything that's created. In every single case, the Quran's response is to point to something bigger and more evident in creation.
And to really drive this point home, the author provides a ton of Quranic citations. We're not talking about 1 or 2 verses here. The evidence is pulled from all over the Quran, from Surah Al-Imran, Saba, Ghafir, and many others. The sheer volume of this textual evidence is there to show that this is a major overarching theme, not just some niche interpretation.
So, where does all this lead? Well, it all builds up to the author's final conclusion, which is all about defining the proper job and, crucially, the limits of the human intellect when it comes to matters of faith. The key term here is aql, which means intellect or reason. And according to the argument in this text, the role of our aql isn't to be some independent explorer trying to map out the unseen world all by itself. No, its proper job is to be a recipient. Its function is to understand, to process, and to be guided by the evidence that's already been presented in Revelation and in the signs of creation.
And here's the final piece of textual proof. The author uses the specific word memnu, which means forbidden. It's an explicit statement that this deductive type of qiyas is forbidden in these core beliefs, and that the intellect has a very specific, guided role to play, not a speculative one. So, the final takeaway is this. The intellect is an amazing, necessary tool, but it's a tool for comprehension, not independent discovery. Its purpose is to look at the evidence that's been laid out by the Creator, the mind-boggling design of the cosmos, the message of Revelation, and to recognize the truth in that argument. It's not meant to create its own arguments about a reality that is, by definition, beyond our direct perception.
And that brings our deep dive to a close. It really leaves us with this huge, central question that the whole text is built around. What are the ultimate boundaries between our own human reason and divine truth?